have come with open hearts. So, Lord, let your ancient words be imparted upon our hearts and our lives. Speak to you in the name of God, who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Ancient words from Matthew chapter 21 and verse 23. Matthew writes that when Jesus entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority? I want us to reflect for a moment in our time together this morning on the authority of God. Now, some of you may recall the now famous poem entitled Invictus by the late 19th century poet William Ernest Henley. But if you don't know the poem, I'm sure that many of you are probably still familiar with the last two lines of the last verse of that poem, and so I will read it for you. The poem goes like this: "Out of the night that covers me, black as the pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance I have not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll." And here are the two lines: "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." For how many of you is this familiar? I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. We hear it again and again. And invictus is the Latin word for unconquered or unbeaten. And so the poem is meant to display the life of one who is unconquered, one who is unbeaten by the adversities of life, one who does not see themselves as a victim of life's circumstances, but instead as one who has the power and strength from within in order to overcome those adversities. And my friends, while there is much that is admirable about having such fortitude in the face of life's adversities, I believe that the poem points towards a now prevalent tendency among ourselves as human beings, which is to exalt the self, to exalt the I, under circumstances where our confidence or our trust in God and in God's providential rule over not just our lives but all creation, under circumstances where that confidence and trust has either been shaken or has been lost altogether. And so in the absence of such confidence and trust in God, therefore I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. But to claim to be the master and captain of our fate and soul is to claim in some sense to be the author of our life itself. For an author is not only one who originates something, but one who also determines the course or direction of that which they have originated. And so in writing a book, an author will determine how the characters develop and the plot or the course of the book will follow. And so there are many who have come to believe in a similar way that they have the power to determine their fate and indeed the destiny of their souls. But we only have to look at history and see that it is replete with examples of those who find themselves under the authority of others, right? Others author their lives, if you will, sometimes for good and sometimes for evil, such that they are neither the masters of their fate nor their souls. And so whether we claim such authority over our lives for ourselves as this Forum Invictus does, or whether we acknowledge some other authority over our lives, I believe that we might agree that there are really two kinds of authority. There is the kind of authority which is associated with, for example, one's position or the office that one holds. And so, when you have this position or you have this office, you have the right to give orders or to make decisions or even to enforce obedience, right? And so you have some who will walk around and say, well, I'm the boss, right? And will remind you that they are the boss. And then there's the authority which one has on account of some recognized gift, some ability, some skill, some knowledge. Right? And so this is the kind of authority where you might say, well, so-and-so is an authority on a particular subject. Right? Or this person carries themselves in a way that they don't have to wave the flag that they are the boss because you know that they are indeed the boss, even if they may not have the title. Right? But yet, how might we as Christians understand these two kinds of authority in relation to God? How might we understand this in relation to God? Because there are many within the church, no doubt, who would not deny that God has authority over our lives. In fact, in the Eucharistic prayer, we refer to Jesus as what? The head of the church and the author. The author of our salvation, the one who brings it into being, the one who determines the course and the direction of it. But I believe that if we understand Jesus as having only one of these kinds of authority and not the other, then we will either serve him grudgingly as an overbearing master who does not deserve this title, or we will see him as being authoritative, yes, in certain aspects, but not ultimately having absolute claim over our lives. He may be good for you, but not necessarily me. And so a common thread running through all of our scripture readings for today is the central fact of God's authority and of our need as God's human creatures to recognize and to acknowledge that authority over and above every other human claim to authority over our lives. And so we trace this thread in the alternate Old Testament account of the waters at Meribah, which is found not in Exodus as we've read, but in Numbers 20, verses 1 through 13. And some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that. But there God tells Moses to take his staff and to command the rock to yield its water. But instead of speaking to the rock, Moses strikes it not once, but twice, saying to the Israelites, "Listen, you rebels, shall we bring forth for you water out of this rock?" And my friends, in so doing, striking this rock with his staff, not once but twice, instead of speaking to it, Moses made God's power and authority appear to be his own rather than God's. And so God said to him, "You did not trust me, Moses, to show my holiness before the eyes of the Israelites." He had somehow lost that trust, right? We trace this thread again in Paul's letter to the Philippians, where Paul appeals to the mind of Christ, to his example of servant-like humility, to his obedience, and to God's exaltation of him. He points to these as being authoritative in the life of the community of those who truly believe in him. This life of servanthood, humility, and obedience. The authority of Christ is recognized and is acknowledged within this community. Paul writes, when they are of the same mind of Christ, when they have the same love, when they are in full accord with one another and of one mind, when no one does anything out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility regards others as better than themselves. But the question of God's authority and what it means, I believe, to recognize and to acknowledge that in a tangible sense is perhaps made most clear in our gospel reading from Matthew. And in it, of Jesus' telling the parable of the two sons. So we are told that the chief priests and the elders among the people have come to Jesus in the middle of his teaching, right, to question the authority by which he taught and performed the signs that he performed in their midst. But Jesus makes an alternate proposal. He says to them that they need to first answer his question before he answers theirs. And he asks them a question about the heavenly or human origin of the baptism that John, you remember John the Baptist, that John had proclaimed. And so they knew instinctively, the moment he asked that question, that this baptism was not of human origin. Their own scriptures had spoken of this one who would come in the wilderness doing what? Declaring, prepare the way of the Lord. So what John was doing, they knew it was not of John, it was of God. But rather than acknowledge God's hand at work in the baptism of John, because if they did that, right, they'd have to face the implications of needing to respond to what John did and what John proclaimed. So rather than acknowledging that what was happening in John's life was of God, they claimed instead not to know its origin. Oh, we don't know Jesus. And so Jesus said, well, neither will I tell you by which authority I'm doing these things. Because of course it is the same authority. My friends, there are none so blind as those who will not see. The most deluded people are those who choose to ignore what they already know. I'll say it again. There are none so blind as those who will not see. And the most deluded people are those who choose to ignore what they already know. And so if they chose to ignore the heavenly origin and authority of John's baptism, then one could rightly expect that they would likewise choose to ignore Jesus' heavenly origin and authority. So in the parable of the two sons which follows, Jesus showed them clearly what it meant to acknowledge rather than to ignore God's authority. And so in the parable, you have this father who issues the very same instruction to his two sons to do what? Go and work in my vineyard. The first son refuses to go. I will not. And he later goes. He reminds me of my 3-year-old. She is of this oppositional phase in her life. I say, Doran, go and do whatever it might be. I will not. She's very verbal. Children have a way of developing patience. Right? And in a similar way, the son says, I will not go. But he changes his mind. And in the second example, the son says that he will go. But he doesn't. And my friends, the fact of the matter is that when it comes to acknowledging the authority of God in Christ, and the fact that God has this authority in our lives, there is no middle ground. In Jesus, we find both kinds of authority. He is the one who holds authority because of who he is, but he also has authority because of what he does. His recognized person as God. And so we are either by our actions working with him, or we are working against him. We are either by our actions acknowledging his rightful authority over our lives, or we are acknowledging that someone else or something else has this authority over our lives which only God should have. And Jesus' authority is not something that can simply be acknowledged by the words of our mouth or by our intellectual assent, but by the observable fact of our obedience to him. He actually went into the vineyard. So acknowledging his authority means that we, with God's help, we strive very hard to follow him, patterning our lives after his own, putting into action, my friends, the very word of instruction that we receive not just from his mouth, but from his life lived among us. And so whatever conception or misconception, as it often is, whatever conception or misconception we may have in our minds about who Jesus is, Paul in his letter to the Philippians seeks to do away with that. And he points to the self-emptying one, who because of his love for us, humbled himself and came among us in human form to serve us, and was obedient to the will of the Father, even to the point of death on the cross. And my friends, because it is God who has done this for us, and because this God has authority not just over our lives, but over all creation, then acknowledging his authority in our lives means nothing less than that we as Christians be of the same mind. It's not just a man, this is God. Do what I do. Be of the same mind. Have the same love. Be in full accord and of one mind with one another as he was. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit. That's how Jesus lived. But in humility, regard others as better than yourselves. It means that we each look not to our own interests, but to the interests of others. Imagine being a part of a community where you don't have to look out for your own interests, because all of your brothers and sisters in Christ around you are looking out for them. That is who we are called to be. So recognizing and acknowledging Jesus' authority means believing in this one whom the Father has sent. Allowing him to pour his life into our own, so that our lives may no longer be focused on ourselves, but focused on him, focused on one another. So it is not about Invictus, but if you look on the slide, it is about ichthus. Ichthus is the Greek word for fish. Right? It's an ancient Christian symbol that was used. You may see it on some person's bracelets or on their license plates or on a bumper sticker somewhere, right? But the Greek letters stand for Jesus Christus, Huios, Theos, Soter. Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior. My friends, they stand for this one who has come among us in order that we might be saved from that unbearable burden and delusion of thinking that our life's fate and our destiny, our salvation, rests entirely upon our shoulders. It does not. It rests in God and God alone, this one whom we are called to follow. May we pray. God of our salvation, God who has authority not only over our lives but over all creation, we falter before the demands of your word and we turn away from your call to life in all of its abundance. Pour out your mercy upon us as you showed mercy to your people of old, that we may turn from our sinfulness and that we may walk in the path of self-emptying love made known in Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.